really appreciate everybody coming out for this. Mud to Lotus, the opening of the masculine heart. How does that sound? Is that okay?
Sounds like we're in the right place.
Yeah. So, I think there's a feeling of that, maybe we put together this panel before a lot of somewhat in the middle, but also there's been a lot of other current events that have been leading to show that this is important work to do. And so I guess there's a feeling that the kind of work, and certainly the kind of work that some of the panelists here have been doing, not just recently, but for a long time on these issues. So I feel we're quite privileged to have people who have really been down in doing the really hard work. And as you hear from, I think I remember Will saying he's done a lot of different types of work, but the gender work almost has this explosive quality and difficulty of just about any work. And I think probably Jeannie, who's done a lot of that, there's a feeling. So I'm really asking for a little bit for a sort of tenderness. And this is about the opening of our hearts, and maybe we could start right now. To kind of, hard work is not, it requires one of the things to really come out, and as Jeannie has said, one of her intentions is to, in a place, if we can work with these issues from a place of understanding and love, I think we can move through this. Those are some of the ingredients that I think are really important to move through this work. So just hoping we can hold that space. We're going to offer a lot of time for the sort of wisdom souls in this to really give us some perspective of those who've been doing that. So I'd like to maybe, and I want to acknowledge one, that we're doing men's work, and there is a woman here on the panel, and not only that, but just bow down that the inspiration for this panel, Jeannie says, hey, will you be, it was her idea to do this panel. So I want to just offer a little bit of space for her to speak about where that inspiration came from and how she sees our way forward here.
Aww. Well, I love men. I have a dad, I have grandpas, I have uncles, I have brothers. I've had a lot of friends, a lot of sweeties. Can you hear me? You can't hear me? Yeah. Help me, Jesus. Thanks. And my heart became tired of hearing the question, what's wrong with those men, in that tone. That we don't have more masculine tenderness leading the show is not because men lack the capacity for tenderness. And there are few spaces, in my experience, outside of men's groups or therapy rooms, where the conditions are safe enough and honoring enough and clear enough that men actually feel safe enough to soften the armor that they carry. And I feel like in this whole theme of humanness that we would be remiss to not address directly the fellows and the brutal conditioning that they receive that turns them into beings that we don't know how to love. So I know I did a men's retreat last year. Kent came, and I know this is a really dear area to his heart, and he's sitting up here, like even when he started talking with the hearts, like so modeling such tenderness, and I just think it's a very beautiful thing to And I feel that about these guys too. Like there's a lot of beautiful embodied masculine heart up on this stage. And I feel like any amount that we can bring that into focus, get a look at it, take a look at the issues, both as men and as women, because we all participate in the craziness, the better.
Thank you, Jeanne. So, because there's a depth of, certainly I know of Will and Jeannie have specifically been working on men's issue for a long time. I want to give maybe each of you a little chance to talk about your work and what that is. Will's been doing gender equity and reconciliation for, 26 years. So with his wife and partner. And has been training now. Anyway, I'll take it away because you can tell me a little bit better than I can.
Well, I'll just begin with the theme of this workshop, which is called Mud to Lotus, Opening the Masculine Heart. And I take that as an alchemical reference, that we need to go into the depths of the mud and then we discover the flowering heart of the truly sacred masculine, if you will. And so I just want to say that the key for that to me is for men to, we all hear about follow your heart. And Joseph Campbell used to say, follow your bliss. For men, I think it's follow your heartbreak. Find out what it is that breaks your heart and go into that. And that will reawaken your humanity that has been lost by the male socialization and will reawaken the sacred. And there are different ways to do that. Reconnecting with the earth is one way. The particular way that I have some experience with is bringing men and women together. And so we've been doing this in this project for 26 years, convening forums for men and women to really hear one another's deep pain and challenge. And for most of the people who come to these programs, they have never been in a forum with that level of truth-telling between people who identify as male and people who identify as female happens. And I want to just mention that for those who identify neither as male nor female, that we invite all people of all gender identities to this work. And we work with the spectrum of gender diversity, but we do in particular work with the people who identify as male or female and with the categories of male and female, because there's been so much deep conditioning and deep wounding in that arena in particular. And the short story is what I can say is that what happens in this work is that men, when they hear the deep and true truth of women's experience, particularly their painful experience and their challenging experience, it transforms them. Men cannot hear the deep pain of women and remain the same men. And the patriarchy knows that, which is why it prevents it from ever happening. So this level of truth-telling is taboo in every institution of society, in the government, in the family, in the church, in the educational institutions, in the military, and in the mainstream media until last year. So that's what our work's about, is really creating forums for the deep truth-telling between men and women. And what happens is then a whole alchemy happens that gives birth to that sacred communion between masculine and feminine that has been trampled on by patriarchy for 10,000 plus years.
Word.
Thank you, Will.
Yeah, thanks.
Charles?
Yeah, it brings to mind a quote from a Kogi Mamo, a Kogi shaman, and he said it about the planet, about the ecosystems, about the earth. He said, if you knew she could feel, you would stop.
Oh.
Like if you knew that the forest and the wetlands could feel what you're doing to them, you'd stop. And I think the same is true. It's exactly what Will was saying. If you knew she could feel, you would stop. And that we are, as men, cut off from feeling what she feels. That cutoff happens in two main ways, I think. One is through ideology or cultural conditioning to see women as objects, to dehumanize them. And the other way, like through pornography, for example, through advertising. And the other reason that we're cut off from feeling what she feels is trauma that has caused us to shut down our feeling capacity. So, when Jeannie was saying that what's wrong with you energy, that can be converted into a gentle curiosity.
Exactly.
Of what's wrong with you? What happened to you? Because every abuser out there, every male violator of women out there was once a baby, was once a sweetums. And something happened to that sweetums. So if we approach that with curiosity, then we can get at the root and to even look at ourselves that way as men. Like what happened to me to cut me off from feeling? I remember what happened to me. The trauma of being bullied in junior high school, and when any emotional display was a weakness that could and would be exploited. So I learned, and then the pain visited on me, how do you deal with that as a kid, You learn not to feel it. So, yeah, and what's the alternative? The alternative would be to use some kind of force to defeat the perpetrators, to shut them down, to shame them, to lock them up, to destroy them. And there are instances where you do need to intervene with force. But if your interventions intensify the conditions from which violence emanates, the feeling of being unsafe, then you're going to fight an endless war. So,
Yeah.
Just stop with that.
In the late 80s, when the men were, banging drums and doing the men's movement and stuff, I was a partner of one of those men, and I was also doing a lot of work with women. And I got really curious about men's conditioning. And I also had the luck to work with a woman named Juliana Simon, who was holding out that women stepping out of our victimization, that in order for me to be a strong, fearless, tender ally of my brothers, I need to step so far out of my own conditioning as a woman. I need to heal so much in order to be that kind of embodied gentle warrior. And so within the context of, there were a group of us who all had male partners, we banded together and supported each other to learn how to hold space for the men in our lives and to move through all of the fury that came up and the no fair that came up and everything that comes up in the context of what we go through as women when we try to reach for you guys, or we try to hold a space for you guys, etc. And so that started some work that I did at some men's conferences around that time called Women as Allies to Men. And I even started a group called Feminists for Men, which just saying feminists for men would be like, what? And this kind of stepping out of the whole dynamic to be independent of it is very unusual and quite possible, but there's a lot of work involved in that. So that was my start. And I was getting all excited. Maybe I would write a book and la, la, la. And then I got plunged into a 5-year dark night of the soul that just, sorry for my language, took the piss out of me. And the culmination of that was a radical opening as being. And so I was invited to teach, and I started doing, the groovy satsang thing and whatever. And then I started growing like a wild weed into my own hybrid that's incredibly embodied and includes an awareness of how the conditioning of groups, the oppressive conditioning, the forming of oppressors out of baby boys, etc., taking all of that into account and doing a kind of work that makes a safe space for anybody to be able to drop into an investigation of what's real, what's true, what's conditioning, and to heal from it. And so I did my first men's retreat, as I said, last year, and I've been doing meetings with men. It was a really big deal for me to do my first meeting with just men, and it was in Berkeley. You were there. I think you might have been there. Such a sweet vulnerability for me. I said, this is outside of both of our conditioning. That I'm sitting in front of all of you men, and I remember at my men's retreat too, having the guys around, and I was teaching some Aikido sword as a metaphor for gentle power. Just the feeling that these 15 men, many of them older than me, hanging on my every word. I don't have the experience that men are afraid of power in women, when power is actually an embodied love, not a sassy pants, hey, jerk, I'm going to tell you how it is. That's not power, that's still division. And we have to move through that bit. We have to be pissed off. We have to do that work. So my work is really to bring a heart with teeth, not a heart that can be knocked over with a little challenge or a little surliness, but a level of heart that's planted and able to see the humanity of everybody. So that's what I do.
Thank you, Jeanne. So, obviously the conditioning is something will continue to be coming up, but maybe before we move into that, maybe we can just look at a little bit, a fresh look at what the actual subject is here. And that what is a man? There is a way, I think, that we've had this men are the masculine and women are the feminine. We all have many different types of openings or awakenings, but one of the most meaningful ones for me was recognizing how utterly feminine I am. And how much that has always been so much a part of myself, and how much I maybe have learned, but how much I had been stomping on that, and how it's so rampant. It's like it's the access to it, the willingness to be that is. Anyway, I'm talking about the conditioning, but what is this man? What is this man? What is this? Masculine, feminine, what is the title? Just let's begin with a little bit in that realm. I know, Charles, you had another talk.
You said some cool stuff earlier.
Gosh, I don't
Say that
remember
again.
what it was.
We don't know men outside of patriarchy.
Oh, right, yeah. We don't know men outside of patriarchy. Yeah, we don't really know what it is to be a man or what a man is outside of patriarchy. I mean, we can look at indigenous matriarchal cultures and get some maybe idea of it, and we can look into ourselves as men if we are in a container where the trappings and reinforcers of patriarchy are temporarily suspended, and we can understand something. And in my experience, there is something, and that is a significant insight for me, that gender is not, as the conventional postmodern teaching would have it, merely a cultural construct, but it is an archetypal energy that originates beyond human beings, that is channeled through culture but is not of culture, that admits to blurriness around the edges and exceptions, but that does not invalidate the general applicability of the binary. And I don't want to get too much into that kind of theory, but what it does for me is it opens up the question, okay, as patriarchy dissolves, who am I as a man? And there are maybe different stories that offer themselves. I mean, one of them is I'm a terrible, monstrous, toxic being, and my salvation comes through abandoning masculinity and embracing my femininity, to the point where we say, like, I really like the title of this, The Masculine Heart, because sometimes we're like, okay, heart, that's the feminine, and mind, that's the masculine. But in Taoist understanding, yin contains yang and yang contains yin. So even if we say, yeah, the heart, the mind, the linear, the rational, that's masculine, the heart is feminine, but then the heart has a masculine and a feminine too. So what is the masculine heart? I'll stop with that for now. I have more, but I'll stop with that question.
Maybe I can pick up there if I could. I love that line from the Kogis. This bracelet actually comes from the Kogis. They gave it to me at a sacred ceremony in Creston about 6 weeks ago. They're doing some healing work at sacred mountains around the whole earth. And I was very privileged to be there. But what you said, if they knew the earth could feel, they would stop. I was an environmental scientist for many years and did a retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh 30 plus years ago. Maybe you were there, David, where Thich Nhat Hanh said to the environmental community, what we most need to do is to hear within ourselves the sounds of the earth crying. And that really gets to the same core issue. And that was inspiring to me in the early days of starting this work, because I applied that what men most need to do is to hear within themselves the sounds of women crying. That somehow the key is for men to experience the pain of women as their own pain, and vice versa. And then there's a bridge across the heart that transforms both. And I'll give you a simple example, because it has all to do with what is a man. In one of our workshops, this one was in South Africa, we had a man, 24 years old, regular South African conditioning macho guy. And at one point in the workshop, there was a woman there who had been brutally raped about 4 months earlier, and she was actually doing our work as a way of preparing to face her rapist in court. She'd been to 2 of our workshops. And in the second one, she told the story with just shattering depth and intensity, not as a victim, but as a witness to the reality of the experience of being raped. And almost no women had ever heard a story quite like that, and I guarantee you none of the men had ever heard this, because part of the male privilege is to not have to know about that, and not have to ever know about women's pain. And he said afterwards, he was so shaken, and he was literally shaking, and his first words were, I don't know how to be a man anymore. I feel traumatized. And so we worked with him and helped him to realize that the reason he felt traumatized was he had genuinely heard this person's pain, just exactly what you're saying, had received her pain, taken it into his own heart, and that was transforming his very identity as a man. So part of the identity that we have in the patriarchal socialization of men is the denial of the faculties of the heart. We call them feelings, but it's much more than just feelings in terms of the emotional sense. It's the spiritual receptivity and sensitivity of the heart's way of knowing. It's the entire revelatory knowledge of the heart, which is denied through patriarchy. So the price we're paying for this is huge. And the idea that men have some privilege compared to what we're paying for that privilege, let me just give one example. Let's just, in this room, just a question for the men. Raise your hands if you, in the last week or 10 days, have taken any explicit steps to avoid being the victim of sexual assault. Look around the room. Okay, now same question for the women. Please raise your hand if you, in the last week or 10 days, have taken any steps of any kind to avoid being the victim of sexual assault. And that was just in the last week and a half. What'd you do in the last year, month? What'd you do 10 years ago, 15? Okay, now back to the men. Raise your hand if you have daughters or younger sisters or nieces, young women in your life. Now you supposedly have this privilege of being able to walk the streets without feeling that threat, but you just saw the world that all of your daughters and sisters and nieces live in. So what men in our work learn is the greatest male privilege. The greatest male privilege is not any of the social advantages afforded to men in patriarchal society. The greatest male privilege is to actively participate in deconstructing the unjust patriarchy itself.
He's swinging for the fence. Yeah.
Jeannie?
Oh, since I'm not a man this lifetime, I can only say my observations. And so I was somebody who I didn't want to know the gender of my baby all the way after she came out of me until I had to know. So she had at least an hour on the planet before either of her parents knew what she was other than a little flesh being. I wanted her to have an hour without conditioning of any sort.
Wow, that's impressive.
I changed all the pronouns in her books to she for her first 2.5 years, not because I hated men, but because I wanted her to feel a world where she was central. So that when she went to preschool, when somebody was reading a story about the dinosaurs, this little family of dinosaurs, she said, "Why aren't any of the dinosaurs girls?" I didn't have that. He was just default, right? I was very interested in all this conditioning stuff, and I imagined that my daughter would be a little jock like me. If I didn't condition her, she would naturally express her jockness, which she didn't at all. She was like a fairy girl. It was amazing. 6-foot-tall fairy girl. But we had a play group with 2 girls and 2 boys and a really progressive childcare person and a really cool group of parents. And I tell you what, when the boys came over to my house, when the play group was at my house, they would walk in the door, excuse my language, their whole thing was, what can we fuck with? That was their energy. It was just like, what can I test? What can I push? What can I whack? What can I break? I want to feel myself against the limitations of the world and go beyond them. And the girls were like, what sort of cooperative, quiet thing can we do over here? And I was a little aghast because I was like looking for my child to be all androgynous and all this. So there does seem to be something interesting in this spectrum, something uniquely, shoot me, don't shoot me, uniquely male about having a male body. There's just something about that. There's something, and then the whole spectrum, like I have probably more masculine energy than feminine energy in terms of the sports that I played and the martial arts that I did. But there's something about men, and there's something about, like I have a sweetie, and there's not a human being on the planet who has the vitamin that guy's body has. There's a vitamin of earthed masculine in his body that I haven't found in any woman's body. Now there's other stuff in women's bodies, and I'm sure some of you guys are like medicine, and then all the spectrum in between. I don't want to obliterate anybody's experience along these lines, but so to me, men are servants of life. Men at their highest want to give their hearts to protect and love what they love and what they find beautiful. And I see this in, the way men, like in my events, sometimes like there'll be a guy doing sound, or I'll drop something and like a man will jump up. It's like the beauty of men's hearts, the way they serve and the way that they shut their mouths and they just try to be good men. There's just something really beautiful about, about the servantness of men in that way. So I just want to say that. I don't know what men are. They're like my fellow humans,
What Jeannie's saying reminds me of some of the teachings of my dear friend Pat McCabe. If you ever have a chance to do a gender workshop with her, she's just a profound teacher, Native American woman.
We work together.
Oh, you work with Pat?
We have worked together.
Yeah. So, yeah, she also speaks of this function of men as ready to put down their lives to protect the feminine, to protect women, to protect children. Just a quick aside, I tried that with my boys too. I have 4 boys, and with Jimmy and Matthew, we got them a dollhouse, and his favorite game was King Kong. That's how he played with the dollhouse, It just didn't work. But yeah, so the question then is, how does this if this is true, if the masculine heart wants nothing more than to be in service to life, how has it been perverted into its opposite? On where it's to assault life. How has that happened? Pat talks about a deep trauma of the white male. Going back to the witch hunts, which we usually think of as creating an ancestral trauma in women. But she points out that every time a woman was dragged to the stake or to the torturers, she had a husband or a son or a father who was powerless to stop it. And was made to watch. And that this trauma has been passed down to the current time. This helplessness, this assault to our fundamental masculine desire to protect, and we couldn't do it. Yeah, and I guess I just want to invoke a field of compassion. Look what's happened to us all for hundreds of years. And it's time for it to stop. And what would you be willing to do for it to stop? Are you ready to make a sacrifice of something for it to stop? Whatever is necessary.
I have one little follow-up about that. One young man that I told you, I don't know how to be a man anymore. 2 years later, he joined our training, which is a year-long training plus an internship. And now he's one of our certified facilitators who's delivering this work in his community in Soweto, near Johannesburg, South Africa.
Yay.
So he had that transformation that shifted his identity as a man, and now he's living that new identity.
That seems so huge to actually, as you were saying about the heartbreak, and it's tricky in this culture to identify a mission for the heart to get behind, and that feels really important for men, to have something that you feel is so worthy of your heart's love and efforts, something that your heart can love, something that your integrity can love. And so many of us, the opportunities are just work in a business. I remember, I worked as a managing software developers, and at some point it was what the hell is the meaning in this? My heart just couldn't do that anymore. And I think when our hearts are it's we're just sort of the walking dead without that thing that sets our heart on fire, and finding what that is so important, to find a channel for that,
So we have a short time and so much ground to cover. So maybe I'll put a bunch of questions together and just really allow you guys to feel what would you like to continue to express, and then we'll have maybe a little bit of time for questions and answers. But so there's a historical time we're living in. I mean, I think there's a lot of folks who feel and recognize and see this, that it's really time to change. There's been such a masculine bias. We've lived in a cultural, historical time, the conditioning that has happened, and where are we going? What is it that we're doing? What can we offer now? You talked about, I love the allies kind of thing, the way that, in seeing you, I think part of the work that you've done is by having a woman be that ally, what that opens up for men. The way that we can combine, the way that the women that you talked about did that for you to really find ways. What are some of the solutions? What are some of the issues? Where are we going? What can we really offer? What's some really practical?
Can I speak first? Well, one of the things that I've really been studying are the energies of yin and yang as life energy comes into manifestation. There's a rising into action, and then there's a falling into yielding. You can see it in plants. The seed resting in the quiet ground, and then you see the yang of the sprout, of the growth, of the sturdying, of the flowering, of the fruit. This is probably this part of the circle is what our culture likes and recognizes, and then the fading and the falling and the rotting and the resting and the decomposing and the resting into the winter. And this is yin, and it's demonized in our culture and it's demonized in our psyches. Men are pussies and wussies and not men if they soften, if they open, if they show any of those qualities. And because we carry those qualities, which are both prized and used, and then we also get that soldier training coming at us, we feel humiliated in those areas of opening, to the degree that when I hold space for people, there's almost nobody who can go into some of the energies of helplessness, hopelessness, vulnerability, incapacity, and not feel a level of humiliation. And what I see in this whole thing is we frame it in terms of men hate women, misogyny, but men have been taught to hate the yin inside them. And we have been taught to hate the yin inside of us. And it takes a complete composting and resting in the ground for true yang to rise in an organic, clean, with life kind of a way. And so we have a yang that is disconnected from the ground of yin, that has spindly legs and big shoulders and is more about rigidity than it is about true strength. And to me, the recognition of the way that softening, open, sinking, grieving, feeling vulnerability allows the roots to be watered and allows then true yang connected to the heart to enter. We absolutely need yang. We need people who can stand and say stop and no more. And here's where we're going, and that kind of energy. My dad had a beautiful energy like that. He would say, get your coats, we're going. It was like yang, like he would just cut through a kind of a too yin swampy thing and just go, get your coats, we're going. It's like, thank you. When somebody speaks with that voice, if we don't kill them because we're all pissed off at authority, it's actually a gift, right? So to me, a big part of this is not only the resolution of trauma, because along all these places that we've been disallowed, there's just great fear and great pain and not knowing how and not feeling safe enough anywhere to soften to that degree. So that kind of personal work turns into collective work. The way that I do my work is in groups, so that we actually kind of have a group healing when we point our boats into a certain area. When the women see the men, women say, oh, the men that come to your work, they're so beautiful. It's like, no, those are men who feel safe. That's what men look like when they feel safe. They're not special men. They're just men who feel safe. So that to me, the exploration, the reclamation, the understanding of how yin and yang function in us, and the reclamation of the beauty of, can you show everybody yourself? Like, look at this fellow, like. Now, I am, the burliest dude has a tender heart in there, and doesn't know necessarily how to find it, value it, feel safe enough to soften, open to the vulnerability that would allow it to be reclaimed and allow that to integrate with his sturdy burliness. So that's my way out.
Okay, add a little bit to the yin and yang thing. Just Jeannie Zandi talks about the masculine yin and the feminine yang, which are ignored in our culture or pathologized, as you were saying. So the masculine yin, like the masculine yang, is the phallic yang, and it's got the qualities of rising and assertiveness and forging into new territory and breaking past boundaries and things like that. Whereas the masculine yin is associated with the testicles, which is about patience, about regenerating, about conserving, about undergirding, about supporting. And we can recognize, at least I recognize, those as masculine qualities as well. So to reclaim those as masculine is important. Otherwise, the craving for the feminine or for the yin then gets put onto the feminine yin, and we become well, how do you? Well, it's the only thing that's available then is the yielding and the receptive, and not that we don't have that as well. Not that each person doesn't have all four of these, but to validate and acknowledge and celebrate the masculine, the testicular masculine, and the feminine yang then is the expulsive, the birthing womb, the menstruating, the impatient. Anyway, long thing, but Jeannie Zandi has a beautiful explanation of all that.
Testicles are descended ovaries, after all. I guess just what I want to say is that one of the pathways for opening the masculine heart is to create forums where men and women can really come together to a level of deep truth-telling that is missing in our culture and is missing in every culture that we've worked in. We've worked in 9 countries. And untold stories keep oppression invisible. And that is the central tool of the patriarchy. And we see by the gigantic payoffs, whether it's the Catholic Church or Harvey Weinstein's non-disclosure agreements, or all the settlements that happen in these sexual scandals, the lengths to which the institutions of society will remain complicit in keeping these truths hidden. The universities, for example, with all of their rape crisis. But, important thing to understand, 90% of the rapes committed on university campuses are committed by 3% of the men, who are repeat offenders given a slap on the wrist and sent back out to keep raping. Same thing within the Catholic Church. The vast majority of pedophilia committed by 6% of the priests. The majority of men are not rapists. They may have been conditioned by a rape culture, and we need to look at how our culture does condition men profoundly to basically be sexual predators. Formally, it's illegal, but in practice, get out there and get as many notches on your member as you can. That conditioning is out there very strongly. So part of what has to happen is we need to transform the whole conditioning of young men. My conviction is that you give a young boy coming of age a choice between a training around the deepest principles of love and devotion, and how to truly love women, and how to discover the intimate mystery of the feminine, when his hormones are raging for just that. Or you give him a choice to go become a warrior and go murder people on the other side of the planet you've never met and know nothing about. Which do you think he would choose? He's not given that choice. But the vast majority of men deeply want a deep connection to the feminine. And they want to internalize it. They want to commune with it. And they're not given the training. So and this comes out of working with thousands of women and men, ordinary women and men in 9 countries. And my deepest conviction is that this gender apartheid, if you will, between the masculine and feminine, which is not just between men and women, but it's in every one of us, that division in which we're cut off. Men are cut off from their masculine yin and women from their feminine yang, however you want to put it. That can be transformed into beloved community. And I've seen it happen, begin to happen within just a few days. So one of the conclusions we come after 26 years of this work with thousands of women and men in 9 countries is that patriarchy is thousands of years old, but it's only a few days deep. It is a shallow system of lies that if you get women and men into a room long enough, and I say it only takes a few days, they can get through to the bottom of that. They can see these shackles made of clay and paper, and they crumble, and they see one another soul to soul, heart to heart, as the shining essence of who they are, beyond the bodies, and reclaim that sacred intimacy that is our birthright as human beings, and that also reclaims our sacred communion with other beings and the earth.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I have a question for you. If I understand and I agree with you that 3% of the men on campus are your predators, 6% of it. But if you get one of those predators in one of your workshops, what happens with them? Because I think my voice is loud enough. You guys know. Oh, for the record. It's on?
Yeah.
Okay. So my question to you is, what does it take with that population, that smaller chunk of the population? The ones that feel entitled, the ones that have the deepest wounding, that they could end up there.
Let me just briefly answer that. I don't have a fully satisfying answer. There are always going to be some people who have really given themselves to pathology that more or less have to be locked up. But even many of those who are locked up, we've worked in prisons, a number of prisons. And this will be an interesting partial reply to your question, because we had, in one case, we were working in a South Africa prison, and we had a group of 36 men, all of whom were convicted of rape and or murder. And when we did this workshop, where we had 4 women and 36 men, because they wouldn't let any women in except our team of facilitators, one of the women told her story. She was a black woman from Kenya. She told her story of being raped at 19, which then gave birth to her son. And she told it with incredible, impeccable authenticity and depth. And it took everything I could do to keep these guys in the room. They wanted out so bad. And I basically said, you get, and you will stay here, and you will hear this. In effect, you had enough courage to do it. Now you hear what happened, because it's this very thing. In fact, the reason they couldn't stay in the room is because they were starting to feel.
Yeah.
And so it's another application of the principle that Charles was saying. The Kogi was saying if they knew she could feel, they would stop. And what I would say is if they knew what she was feeling, they would stop raping. The vast majority, even rapists, would stop. And several of those men came up afterwards, dripping in tears, just melted down, just with such apology to this one woman, because she was the proxy for the women they had raped. So what I would suggest to you is, except for a very small percentage of truly pathological people, I think the majority of rapists would stop raping. And the majority of men are not rapists, but that those who are would stop, if they knew.
Craig?
Okay, let's.
Yeah, I just had a reflection that came forward when you were speaking. I have two beautiful daughters and a beautiful wife, and the toughest part of my day is watching my daughter walk out the door and go to school. I know I can't protect her. And I know what happens, and as a therapist, I've heard the stories too many times. And it's just brutal to see that. And I even have it with my young one who's 4, and I think when I drop her off at the babysitter and there's a man or an adolescent boy, and there's times when it's just frightening, it's terrifying. Mm-hmm. And I just deeply appreciate the work that you all are doing.
Mm. Can we go back there to that fellow way in the back?
Yeah. And the last, it's going to be the last one.
So thank you for a wonderful talk. The question that I had was, we spoke about conditioning from culture and from the past. Now, there is something in the genes and the biology of a male and a female, and the way the male is seeking sex and the female is, I don't know what, because I'm not a female. But, how do you deal with that aspect, which is you're born with it, whether, for the first, are you conditioned that kid or not, he or she is born with those genes and that biology. So how do you deal with that?
I'm not sure your question. You mean the sexuality part, that men
Yes.
are kind of biologically?
Yeah, I know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, like the whole.
Go, Charles.
Yeah, I know what he's talking about. Well, it's like the whole thing that, men are evolutionarily conditioned to, motivated to spread their seed as widely as possible, and et cetera, et cetera. That is really shaky on scientific grounds. There's a book, Sex at Dawn, you can read that thoroughly debunks that myth. That's more of a projection of the patriarchal situation than something that's actually, matriarchal cultures were not like that at all. So yeah, scientific myth, basically. Yeah.
The other thing I would add is that, and one of the teachings we do in our training is, hey guys, you got 7 chakras. You don't need just to relate from the second one. And the woman has 7 chakras, so open the other chakras and relate on all levels. Yeah.
Not to discount the beauty of the second chakra.
Not at all. But
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Really appreciate. Thanks for these.
Thanks, you guys.